Come in and get settled. Dim the screen if you can, or just let your eyes go soft. Tonight we're going down into adventure time again, but not the way we've gone down before. There are parts of the land of Ooh that most people never reach, not because they're hidden exactly, but because they sit off to the side of the main road in a background joke, in a season nobody rewatches as often, in a single line of dialogue that changes everything if you're paying attention and means nothing if you're not. Tonight is for the side roads. An owl who isn't just an owl. A sword made of grass that became a person and then stopped being one. A woman named Susan who forgot she used to speak in full sentences. A red, four-eyed thing that might be older than the idea of eyes. A family that a lonely little girl built out of candy and then had to watch turn against her. And underneath all of it, the actual human beings who drew this world into existence, one exhausted decision at a time. Let's go. There's a character in Adventure Time that a huge number of viewers watched for years without understanding what they were looking at. He shows up in dreams. He's an owl, cosmic in scale, quiet in demeanor, and his presence in any dream means that dream is going to come true, not might come true, will. That's the rule the show eventually spells out, plainly, the way it tends to spell out its stranger cosmological facts, without fanfare, as though it's the most natural thing in the world for a bird made of stars to be personally responsible for which of your dreams are prophecy and which are just noise. The show first put him in front of the audience early in the second season episode Prisoners of Love, where his appearance in the Ice King's dream marks a turning point in how the show would eventually treat that character. The first small crack in the comic villain that would later split wide open into Simon Petrikov. But at that point, nobody knew what he was. He was just an owl in a dream, strange and silent, the kind of image you register and move past because the joke of the episode is happening somewhere else. He came back. He kept coming back. Over years, always inside somebody's sleep, always signaling that whatever was happening in that dream, however absurd, was going to bleed into waking life eventually. Jake dreams about a banana man and a rocket ship and suffocating in space without a helmet, and the owl appears at the end of it, and Jake wakes up convinced he has just had what the show calls a croak dream, a dream that predicts your death. It is worth sitting with that phrase for a second. Croak dream. Not a bad dream, not a warning dream. A dream that tells you when you're going to die and how. That's a heavy piece of folklore to drop into a cartoon about a boy and his dog, and the show drops it casually, the way Ooh drops most of its heaviest things. Wrapped in a joke about produce-based space travel, Jake doesn't die. Later, years later, in the episode The Comet, the dream circles back and resolves itself sideways, the way premonitions in this show tend to. It wasn't foretelling Jake's death after all. It was foretelling the moment a character called Banana Man would save his life instead. The prophecy was real. The reading of it was wrong. That's a detail worth carrying forward, because it turns out to be true of nearly every dream the cosmic owl ever touches. Finn dreams that he's in a purple room with his father and a strange, transformed being called Sweet Pea, and Jake is there taking photographs, and a mysterious bird woman produces a disco ball from nowhere in particular. None of it makes narrative sense at the time. All of it turns out, eventually, scattered across different episodes and different seasons, to have been literal. The disco ball shows up for real. The purple room shows up for real. The show was telling the truth. It just wasn't telling it in an order anyone could follow in the moment, which is, if you think about it, exactly how prophecy tends to behave in every mythology that has ever taken it seriously. You only understand the dream once you're already living inside what it meant. For a long time, the cosmic owl functioned as pure mechanism, a plot device with feathers, a way for the writers to plant seeds that would germinate seasons later. And then, in season 6, in an episode called Hoots, the show did something it does better than almost anyone else working in animation. It took a piece of pure mechanism and gave it an inner life so specific and so sad that you couldn't look at the mechanism the same way again. Hoots reveals that the cosmic owl is lonely. He lives, as far as the show is willing to specify, in something like a cosmic motel, and he likes board games, and he has never really had anyone to play them with in the enormous stretch of eternity that a being like him is apparently required to occupy. He falls for another dream visitor, a charismatic stranger, and it's genuine, the kind of infatuation that makes a person, or an owl, or whatever taxonomic category applies to a creature born before most of existence had settled into its current shape. Forget the responsibilities that used to define them entirely. He starts shirking his duty. He lets someone else start interfering with the dreams he's supposed to be safeguarding. And when he finally understands what she's actually doing, that she's been quietly wrecking the futures of people like Princess Bubblegum and Gunter for her own amusement, he has to kill her. He does it. And then he sits with what he did. And the show lets the silence, after that killing, stretch out a little longer than a children's cartoon strictly needs to, because it wants you to feel the specific flavor of that particular grief, the grief of having loved something you had to be the one to end. That would already be enough for one background character in a show packed with hundreds of them, but the show wasn't finished. In The Bird and the Clock, an episode that arrived later in the run, the cosmic owl's real origin gets excavated, and it turns out to be one of the strangest and quietly saddest pieces of cosmology the show ever built. Once, at what the show describes as the dawn of most things, there were two brothers, cosmic pranksters, the kind of ancient jokers who exist in mythologies the world over, forever getting into trouble with forces bigger than themselves. They were forbidden from eating a particular pizza. This detail is, on its face, ridiculous, and the show knows it's ridiculous, and it commits to it completely anyway, because that combination, the ridiculous detail delivered with total sincerity, is the exact frequency Adventure Time broadcasts on when it's at its best. They ate the pizza anyway, and when the punishment came, one brother turned on the other to save himself. He blamed his sibling for the whole scheme. The betrayed brother was banished into something the show calls oblivion, sent down into what would later be understood as the undergrowth to process. In whatever form an ancient cosmic entity processes anything, the trauma of what had happened to him. He became the karmic worm. The brother who did the betraying wasn't spared either, not really. His punishment was arguably worse, precisely because it looked, from a distance, like nothing at all. He was condemned to wander through dreams for the rest of time, making prophecies come true whether he wanted to or not, forever watching other people's futures resolve around him while never quite getting one of his own that felt like it belonged to him. He became the cosmic owl. The betrayer's sentence was loneliness dressed up as a job description. He gets to see the future. He doesn't get to have one, not in any way that includes companionship that lasts, because every time he starts to build something for himself, the machinery of his own function seems to take it away from him. This is speculation, and the show never states it in these exact terms, But it's hard not to read the Cosmic Owl's story as one of the clearest statements Adventure Time ever made about guilt. Here is a being who did something unforgivable to someone he loved a long, long time ago, in circumstances so ancient the show can only gesture at them through the register of myth rather than history. And the punishment that followed didn't erase him or destroy him. It just made him watch, forever, other people's endings arrive on schedule while his own life stayed suspended in a kind of permanent, lonely present tense. There's something almost unbearably tender about the detail that he likes board games. Board games are, at their core, a way of manufacturing company. You need someone else at the table. The cosmic owl, sentenced to eternity as a solitary functionary of fate, wants nothing more elaborate than someone to sit across from him and roll the dice. When Fiona and Huntress Wizard are later put on cosmic trial for killing him in the spin-off series that extends this mythology even further, the proceedings nearly send them into a millennium of punishment, and the case only falls apart because the jury can't agree on how much blame to assign, because even the cosmic bureaucracy that governs beings like the cosmic owl seems to sense that his story was never simple enough for a clean verdict. And when Fiona and Cake finally meet his brother, the karmic worm, and have to be the ones to tell him that the cosmic owl is dead, the worm's first reaction is anger, an old, patient, cosmic anger that has had eons to compound. But it resolves, eventually, into something closer to grief, because it turns out that even after everything, even after the betrayal and the banishment and the millennia apart, family, or whatever the equivalent of family looks like, when you're a pair of ancient beings who used to eat forbidden pizza together at the edge of existence, doesn't fully dissolve. It just goes dormant. It waits. I want you to hold that story for a second, because it's the kind of thing this show does constantly and rarely gets credit for outside its most dedicated audience. A background gag about a weird owl that shows up in a handful of episodes turns out, if you follow it all the way down, to be a meditation on betrayal, punishment, loneliness, and the strange mercy of being remembered by the one person you wronged even after death. That's not filler, that's architecture. It was built to hold weight, and it does. Think about how many times, across your own life, you've watched somebody perform confidence, or cheerfulness, or total indifference to a situation, and only found out much later, sometimes years later, that the performance was covering something closer to what the cosmic owl carries. A job that looks like it, from a certain angle, might actually be a punishment, a role that keeps you present in every important moment while somehow ensuring you never get to be the main character in your own. The show never asks you to feel sorry for him outright. It simply gives you the information and lets the sympathy arrive on its own schedule, the same way his own prophecies do. That's a kind of storytelling discipline that's easy to underrate, because it doesn't announce itself. Nobody in OO delivers a speech about how sad the cosmic owl's life is. Nobody has to. The show trusts you to do the arithmetic yourself, the same way it trusts you to notice a rusted highway sign in the corner of a candy-colored frame without a character stopping to point at it and explain what it means. If you're settling into this one the way you settled into the last few, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I like knowing where these are landing. Somebody's always up at an hour that makes no sense back where I am, and there's something quietly nice about that. All these different clocks, all pointed at the same dim screen. Anyway, let's keep going. because the next layer down involves a sword, a curse nobody meant seriously, and a person who was never supposed to exist and had to spend his short life figuring out what that meant. In the seventh season, Finn buys a sword from a wizard in the woods for $3. That's it. That's the whole transaction on its surface. Jake tells him he needs a new weapon because his previous sword, one carved from demon blood with its own complicated history, has broken, and the two of them go shopping the way you'd go shopping for almost anything else in Ooh, wandering until they find a teepee that seems promising. Inside is the grassy wizard, a minor, somewhat inept magic user whose primary character trait, according to his own later admission, is that he likes cursing things without necessarily being very good at it. He sells Finn a sword made of grass. As Finn walks away with his new purchase, the wizard mutters something under his breath. Remember, no takebacks. It plays, in the moment, as a punchline. A gag about return policies, dropped into a fantasy transaction, the kind of anachronistic joke Adventure Time loves to slip in sideways. Tree Trunks, the elderly elephant who appears throughout the show as a source of homespun, unsettlingly accurate wisdom, is the first to notice that something is wrong with the sword. Finn slices an apple with it for her, and the cut is too clean. Something is terribly wrong with that sword, she says, in the specific tone the show reserves for characters who are right about things nobody else is prepared to take seriously yet. She was right. The grass sword turns out to be genuinely cursed in the oldest sense of the word, the sense where a curse isn't a spell so much as a slow, patient consequence, working itself out over time, regardless of anyone's intentions. It has a mind of its own. It cuts things with unnatural precision. At one point, it moves entirely independently, slicing an enemy in half without any input from Finn at all. And that enemy, notably, is a being who was previously described as immune to any mortal blade, a detail that quietly tells you the grass sword was never simply mortal to begin with. Finn keeps using it anyway, the way people keep using tools that have started to behave strangely, because it works, because it's useful, because the alternative is admitting that something in your possession has developed intentions of its own, and you'd rather not look directly at that fact yet. The sword becomes part of his arm eventually, growing into him, an extension of his body the way his previous grass arm had been after he lost his original limb. And then, in the episode Reboot, everything the sword had been quietly building toward arrives all at once. Finn, provoked by an out-of-control ally, punches the grass tentacles back under control, and in doing so, the grass touches something it had apparently been reaching toward the entire time. Another sword, the Finn sword, an artifact from an alternate timeline that had been sitting dormant, containing inside it a small trapped version of Finn himself, the residue of a branch of reality that had collapsed. What happens next is one of the stranger pieces of body horror the show ever allowed itself, rendered, as always, in bright colors and with a straight face. Inside the Finn sword, something the show calls a grass demon had already been at work, a spider-octopus creature that described itself when it finally spoke as a curse and an emissary from beyond, phrases it offered with no further explanation, as though further explanation would have ruined the effect. The grass demon had wrapped the small trapped Finn in a cocoon of its own material. Both the demon and its captive wanted out of the sword. And when the grass sword touched the Finn sword, all of that pressure released at once, and what emerged was something new. A grass humanoid, carrying the memories of the trapped Finn, carrying whatever the grass demon was, wearing Finn's face and Finn's history without actually being Finn. He would come to be known as Fern. Fern believed, at first, that he was the real one. This isn't a small detail. It's the entire tragedy in miniature. He had Finn's memories up to the point of his own creation, every adventure, every friendship, every scrap of identity that makes a person recognizable to themselves, and none of the lived experience of actually being a separate, continuous person distinct from the boy those memories belong to. He attacked Finn to protect someone, the way Finn himself would have. He was confused when Jake told him he wasn't who he thought he was. He ran. He went to the tree fort, greeted a bewildered BMO, looked through a scrapbook documenting Finn and Jake's adventures, adventures Fern remembered as his own, and had, according to the show's own account, a complete breakdown, smashing dishes, destroying records, spraying syrup across the apartment in a fit of grief and confusion that reads, if you sit with it for more than a passing second, as something closer to an existential crisis than a cartoon tantrum. Imagine discovering, all at once, in your first hours of independent existence, that every memory you have of being loved, of being brave, of being someone's brother, belongs to somebody else, and that you are, at best, a copy, and at worst, something the world has no category for at all. The show doesn't let Fern be simply tragic or simply villainous. It does something more difficult, which is to let him be genuinely uncertain about his own nature for the rest of his short existence. He tries to find purpose. He tries, at points, to be good, inheriting Finn's impulse toward heroism the way a plant inherits sunlight, reaching for it because it's there, without fully understanding why it matters to him. He can't eat, because he has no digestive system worth the name. He can't play Finn's flute, because he can't breathe. He is, functionally, a small ecosystem shaped like a boy, trying to live a boy's life anyway. He confronts the grassy wizard who made the sword that started this entire chain of events, and the wizard, when finally pressed for an explanation, offers one that is almost insultingly small. He made the grass sword as a joke, riffing on the phrase blade of grass, nothing more considered than that. Fern beats him for it. It's hard to blame him. Somewhere out there is a wizard who built, entirely by accident, out of boredom and a pun, the mechanism that would eventually produce a person, torment that person with an identity crisis no one should have to survive, and then hand him over, indirectly, to forces that would use him as a weapon, because that's what happens. Fern is eventually killed, shattered into loose grass and a single stray eyeball, a death rendered with a bluntness the show rarely applies to characters it has spent real time developing. And then he's brought back by Uncle Gumbald, resurrected and repurposed as the Green Knight, a weapon aimed at the people who used to be his only frame of reference for what a life could look like. His story ends, finally, at Golb's arrival during the great confrontation the show had been building toward across its entire run. Fern fights, he helps, and without the corrupting influence of the grass demon still tangled through him, which he has, by this point, confronted and killed inside a shared dream, taking control of his own existence in the only way available to him, he begins to come apart. He dies, leaving behind a small seed, shaped unmistakably like the sword that made him. Finn plants it. It grows, over the span of the show's extended timeline, into an enormous tree, with a new Finn sword eventually resting in its branches, discovered centuries later by two children who have no idea what history is folded into the wood beneath their hands. There's a phrase people use about creation myths, the idea that some things exist only because something else already existed and had a flaw in it, a crack, a mistake, a joke told without enough care. Fern is that phrase made literal. He exists because a minor wizard couldn't resist a pun, because a sword cracked during an unrelated fight, because grief and identity and memory all happen to intersect in exactly the wrong configuration at exactly the wrong moment. He didn't ask to exist. Almost nobody in mythology who exists this way ever does. And yet the show insists, gently and without sentimentality, that his short, confused, borrowed life still mattered enough to grow something real out of what was left of it. That's speculation on my part, reading meaning into a plot resolution the writers may have intended more simply. But it's hard to watch a tree grow out of a dead clone's grief and not feel like the show wanted you to draw exactly that conclusion. There's a specific kind of loneliness in Fern's story that's different from every other kind of loneliness this show puts on screen, and it's worth naming precisely because the show itself never quite names it either. Marceline is lonely because she outlived everyone she loved. The Ice King is lonely because a curse hollowed out his memory and left the shell of a man wandering rooms built for a family he can no longer picture. Fern's loneliness is stranger than either of those, because he was never given a full life to lose in the first place. He inherited someone else's memories the way you might inherit a house that was never actually yours, familiar in every hallway, foreign in the sense that you have no earned right to any of it. He spent his entire brief existence auditioning for a role that had already been cast, trying to win the right to a life that technically preceded his own arrival by years, and the tragedy of him isn't that he failed at that. It's that there was never a version of trying that could have succeeded, because the part was never open to begin with. Some viewers read Fern as a story about clones, or duplicates, or the ethics of copying a person without their consent, and those readings are fair enough. But underneath that framing sits something plainer and harder to shake once you notice it. The specific ache of arriving into a life that has already been fully lived by somebody else, and having to decide, in whatever short time you're given, whether that borrowed life is worth wanting anyway, even knowing it was never yours to keep. There's another figure worth pausing on before we leave the cosmic register entirely, because he's been standing quietly in the corner of this mythology since the second season, and most viewers only register him as a running gag about a skeletal cowboy who occasionally shows up to collect souls. Death, in Adventure Time, rules over the land of the dead, styled visually like something out of an old western, a tall figure in the aesthetic of a gunslinger, rather than the traditional hooded specter most stories reach for. He first appears in the episode Death in Bloom, summoned after Finn and Jake accidentally kill one of Princess Bubblegum's prized flowers and have to travel into the underworld to retrieve its soul, a plot that treats the death of a houseplant with exactly the same procedural seriousness the show would later bring to the death of a beloved main character. Death can be bargained with. Death can be tricked. Death, crucially, is friends with Peppermint Butler, and that friendship is the detail that quietly recontextualizes everything else you thought you understood about the small, polite, candy-coated servant who has been standing behind Princess Bubblegum's throne since the show's earliest episodes. Finn and Jake are saved in that very first encounter, specifically because Death owes Peppermint Butler a favor, or trusts him, or simply likes him enough to look the other way, and the show never bothers explaining exactly which of those it is, because the ambiguity itself is the point. Whatever Peppermint Butler actually is, Whatever he's actually done in whatever dark corners of Oo's history the show declines to fully illuminate, it's substantial enough that Death himself treats him as an equal rather than a subject. There's a smaller, stranger detail buried in Death's design that's worth including because it's rarely discussed even among longtime fans. Among his abilities, the show attributes to Death the specific power to return a memory to someone with a kiss, a detail that sits uneasily alongside his role as the administrator of endings, since it implies he's also, in some limited capacity, an administrator of restoration. A being whose entire cosmic function is to take things away also carries, quietly, the power to give something back, provided the right circumstances align. The show never builds a major plot around that ability. It just leaves the detail sitting there, in his profile, in his mythology, unclaimed and unexplained. The kind of thing this show does constantly, planting a strange capability in a minor character's backstory and trusting that some portion of its audience will notice it, turn it over, and wonder what story might have used it if the writers had ever needed one to. Now go further down, past the sword, past the wizard, into the ground itself, because there's a whole tribe of people living underneath the Candy Kingdom that most casual viewers remember, if they remember them at all, as a joke about fish-headed cave dwellers who got scared off by shadow puppets. That's a real underestimation of what's actually going on with the humans and with the woman who leads them, and with what her story eventually reveals about the entire human population of Oo. Ben spends the early seasons of this show believing, with the quiet, unspoken weight of someone who has decided not to think about something too hard because thinking about it too hard would hurt, that he is the only human being left in the world. Princess Bubblegum brings it up once, almost carelessly, reminding him of his uniqueness in a way that clearly unsettles him more than he lets on. And Finn's response is about as emotionally articulate as an 11 or 12-year-old boy is capable of being about something this large. He says, thinking about it too much makes him feel, in his own words, all soul-searchy and weird. That's the whole of it. That's a child's entire vocabulary for existential isolation, delivered as a throwaway line before he goes back to pulling up tree stumps with his dog. Not long after, digging in a field where an entire grove of trees has been mysteriously felled, Finn and Jake find a metal hatch. Underneath it, in an underground cave lit by whatever passes for light down there, is a tribe of frightened, primitive people wearing animal-themed hats, not unlike Finn's own, afraid of shadows, afraid of nearly everything, speaking in a language that isn't quite English, but clearly used to be. Finn is elated. He believes, immediately and completely, that he's found others of his kind. Living proof he isn't the last one. He's wrong, and the way he's wrong matters. Susan Strong and her tribe, called humans, turn out to be humanoid mutants, descendants. The show implies, without ever fully confirming, of humans who were exposed to the mutagenic fallout of the Mushroom War and transformed at a genetic level into something adjacent to human, but not the same thing. When the Marshmallow Kids of the Candy Kingdom accidentally set several of them on fire during an attempted invasion, their burning hats fall away to reveal fins, gills, ichthyoid features tucked discreetly around their faces, where clothing usually hides them. Finn's reaction, according to the show's own description, is a kind of shock that borders on grief. He wasn't looking at his own kind. He was looking at what happens to people when the world does to them what the Mushroom War did to the Earth. Transformation without consent. Survival purchased at the cost of a body that no longer quite belongs to the species it started as. It's worth noting, as speculation grounded in production detail rather than anything stated on screen, that the original storyboards for this episode reportedly labeled the hatch leading down to the humans with the words biohazard danger, a warning that never made it into the finished episode, but that confirms the writers were thinking from the very beginning in terms of radiation and contamination rather than simple fantasy monster design. The show sanded the edge off that detail for the final cut, the way it often did with its darkest implications, letting you feel the shape of the horror without spelling out its exact chemical cause. Susan herself turns out to be stranger still. Over the seasons that follow, in episodes spaced out with the patience this show reserves for its longest running mysteries, it's revealed that Susan isn't actually a human at all. She's a full human, unmutated, biologically the same as Finn, but marked by something the mutants around her never had to carry: a cybernetic implant embedded directly into her skull. Her birth name is Kara. Her designation in whatever system produced her was Seeker XJ77. She was trained on one of the human settlements that exist far offshore, on islands where the last significant population of unmutated humanity fled after the war, specifically to work as a seeker, a kind of border enforcement unit whose job was to prevent people from leaving those islands and to keep outside dangers from finding their way in. She was a soldier, essentially, built and trained by a society organized entirely around fear of the mainland, sent out to patrol the boundary between the world her people had chosen to abandon and the safety they'd built in its place. Something went wrong. She ended up crashing, injured, memory shattered, and found her way, or was found, into the underground world of the humans, where she lived for years believing she was one of them, forgetting her own language, forgetting her mission, forgetting almost everything about who she used to be, until Finn and Jake, without meaning to, started teaching her English again, one careful word at a time, as though reteaching a person their own native tongue. Picture what that must have actually felt like from the inside, if a being made of memory and fracture, like Susan, can be said to have an inside the way we mean it. Waking up one day, or one gradual stretch of days, in a cave full of strangers who wear animal hats and flinch at their own shadows, with no clear sense of how you got there, no working vocabulary to ask, and a body that still, on some cellular level, remembers being trained for a mission it can no longer name. She wasn't confused the way a child is confused, still building a first understanding of the world from scratch. She was confused the way an adult is confused after real trauma, carrying the shape of a fully formed person with none of the content left inside it, relearning words for things she'd once known perfectly well: the sun, water, fire, danger, one at a time. From a couple of children who assumed, reasonably enough given what they were looking at, that they'd simply found someone who had never learned English at all. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being underestimated that way, in having people be kind to you because they think you're starting from nothing, when the truth is, you're actually trying to find your way back to somewhere you've already been. There's a detail buried in this that the show never lingers on for long, but that carries an enormous amount of weight if you let it. When Finn first meets Susan, she stumbles over the word sun, trying and failing to communicate the simplest possible concept, the thing that rises every morning and makes the whole world visible. Finn mishears her attempt and names her Susan on the spot, out of a well-meaning but completely wrong guess at what she was trying to say. She spent years after that being called by a name that was, in the most literal sense, a misunderstanding of the one word she was still fighting to remember. That she could recognize the concept of the sun and gesture toward wanting to name it, even while everything else about her old life had been stripped away, suggests something the show later confirms. She wasn't primitive. She was a fully articulate adult who had been reduced by trauma and implant and circumstance to something closer to a child relearning her own mind, and everyone around her, for years, simply assumed the version of her they met was the only version that had ever existed. The implant matters too, and it complicates any easy reading of Susan as a simple victim. Later episodes reveal that the device in her head can activate against her will, overriding her personality entirely, turning her voice robotic, compelling her to treat Finn as an objective to be delivered somewhere, rather than a friend she spent years caring about. In one confrontation, she absorbs the destructive blast of an enormous guardian construct and uses the power to grow monstrous, entirely outside her own control, before Finn finally destroys the implant and lets her come back to herself. That she can be turned at any moment into a weapon aimed by people she's never met, using a body she didn't fully choose to carry, gives her story a dimension that goes beyond simple tragedy into something closer to horror about autonomy itself, about what it means to be a person whose own mind isn't entirely load-bearing, whose loyalty and love and memory can be switched off by a signal from very far away. The human colonies she came from, when Finn and Jake eventually visit them during the extended arc the show calls the Islands, turn out to be exactly what you'd expect from a society built entirely around institutional fear. Cautious, insular, defined by rules, meant to keep a small, surviving population safe by keeping the rest of the world firmly on the other side of an ocean. Finn's own mother lives there, having devoted her entire existence to caretaking, eventually uploading her consciousness into a network of robotic helpers so she could continue looking after people even after her physical body could no longer keep up with the demand of it. It's a portrait of protection curdling slowly into control, of love expressing itself as walls. And Susan is, in a very real sense, one of the wall's casualties, sent out as a seeker to guard a border that the people inside it were too frightened to ever cross themselves. She found her way past that border eventually, lost her memory doing it, rebuilt an entire second identity underground among people who weren't even her own species, and then had to rebuild a third identity on top of both of those, once Finn and Jake helped her remember who she'd been all along. Very few characters in this show carry that many discarded selves inside a single body. That she remains, through all of it, recognizably brave, recognizably kind, recognizably herself, in whatever sense that word can still apply, might be the most quietly heroic thing about her. Think about what it would actually mean to live the way Susan has lived, moving through three entirely different understandings of who you are without ever getting the luxury of choosing which one gets to be the real you. There's a version of her that was built and trained as a weapon by people who claimed to love her enough to keep her locked away from the world. There's a version of her that forgot every word of her native language and learned an entirely new one from a lost boy who assumed she was just like him. And there's the version that exists now, stitched together out of the wreckage of the first two, carrying all of it at once, never fully any single one of them again. Most people go their whole lives with the comfortable assumption that identity is something solid underneath all the noise, a bedrock self you can always return to if the noise ever quiets down. Susan Strong is what the show looks like when it wants to ask, gently and without ever using language, this heavy, what happens to a person when there isn't a bedrock left to return to, only the accumulated weight of every self you've had to be in order to survive whatever came for you next. Sit with that for a moment before we go further down, because the next layer isn't about a person at all. It's about the thing waiting underneath every other layer of this show's mythology, the entity the Lich himself claimed to serve, the being whose name the show wrote entirely in capital letters, as though normal type simply couldn't hold it. Golb first appears in this show years before anyone knew to call him that. In the episode Puhoi, back in season 5, Finn retreats into an elaborate pillow fort and ends up transported into an entire alternate reality made of pillows, living out what amounts to a full pillow-based lifetime, aging, working, eventually dying inside that soft, strange pocket dimension. And when he dies there, his spirit goes flying back out through space toward U, and on the way, he bounces, quite literally, off the tongue of an enormous red four-eyed creature that tries and fails to eat him. That's the first appearance. A gag. A weird, unsettling image in an otherwise whimsical episode, delivered and then abandoned. The kind of thing the show does constantly, planting something strange in the corner of a frame and trusting you to either notice it or not. There's a specific texture to how the show handled this particular secret that's worth noticing, because it's different from how it handled the Lich, or Orgalorg, or almost anything else in its cosmology. Most of this show's biggest reveals arrive with build-up, with music cues, with dialogue that signals to the audience that something important is happening. Golb's earliest appearance arrives with none of that. It's a sight gag in a pillow fantasy episode, over almost as fast as it starts. No fanfare, no lingering camera, nothing to tell you that you just glimpsed the single largest threat the show would ever produce. That's a deliberate kind of patience, whether the writers knew from the beginning exactly what they were building toward, or, more likely, given how organically this show tended to develop its mythology, simply liked the image enough to leave the door open for later. Either way, it means that anyone rewatching Puhoi years after the finale gets to have a genuinely strange experience, watching an early, silly episode and suddenly realizing that the true final antagonist of the entire series had been sitting there, fully designed, fully menacing, for 5 years before anyone in the audience had any reason to be afraid of him. It came back, slowly, in pieces, over years. In You Forgot Your Floaties, a character named Margles is abducted, and her husband, a being known variously as Magic Man, or King Man, or Normal Man, depending on which stage of his own long, strange arc you catch him in, is revealed to have lost her to something that attacked Mars, something the show doesn't name yet but clearly wants you to file away. Season 8's Whispers drops the next piece. The Lich, in one of his rare moments of something like reverence, refers to himself as the Ceaseless Wheel, the last scholar of Golb. It's the first time the name appears, cryptic, unexplained, delivered by the show's most cosmically ancient villain, as though it were a title of enormous religious significance, which, as it turns out, it is. This is worth pausing on, because it recontextualizes everything the earlier chapters of this examination covered about the Lich. He wasn't simply a force of entropy operating on its own inscrutable logic. He was, in his own understanding of himself, a devotee, a believer, working toward the extinction of all life not out of hatred but as an offering, a kind of worship aimed at honoring a being he considered greater than himself. That's a genuinely unsettling reframe of a character the show had already spent years developing. The most dangerous entity in U's mythology considered himself a religious minor figure in someone else's story. Season 9's Temple of Mars finally gives Betty Groff, Simon's long-lost fiancée, a plan. Rescue Margles, save Simon, and do both by confronting Golb directly. And then, in the series finale, everything the show had been quietly seeding for 5 years arrives all at once. The sky over the great battlefield between Princess Bubblegum's forces and Uncle Gumbald's opens, and Golb descends, enormous, red, four-eyed, roughly humanoid, in the way a nightmare is roughly humanoid, meaning only enough to make the wrongness of the rest of it land harder. Simon, upon seeing him, flashes back to a memory from before the Mushroom War, back when he and Betty were still an ordinary, engaged couple, making sundaes in an ordinary kitchen, reading a book that mentioned Golb in passing, the way you might read a footnote about an ancient myth without expecting it to matter to your actual life. Simon, describing him then, said his presence is felt in every crevice where chaos lurks, and mused, half joking, about what it would mean to harness that kind of energy. It is one of the show's most quietly devastating structural choices that this idle, romantic, hypothetical conversation between two people who loved each other before the world ended becomes, centuries later, the literal plan Betty pursues to save the man she lost. She spent 1,000 years trying to make an old joke from before the apocalypse into something real enough to bring him back. It goes wrong immediately and completely. Golb is too vast for anyone to control, let alone bargain with. He warps Gumbald's cupcake soldiers into a massive, hostile creature. He corrupts one of Princess Bubblegum's guardian constructs into something monstrous. Betty, deep in a trance of her own making, refuses to be talked down, telling Simon, in effect, that stopping her now would mean abandoning her closest chance in a millennium of finally saving him. The fighting escalates into something close to full cosmic collapse before anyone figures out the single detail that turns the entire confrontation around. Golb, the embodiment of pure chaos and disorder, is vulnerable to harmony, not weapons, not magic in the conventional sense. Song. Bimo, badly damaged, terrified, alone inside the wrecked tree fort, begins to sing anyway, a piece called Time Adventure, and the melody generates a field that Golb's chaotic essence simply cannot tolerate. Princess Bubblegum and Marceline hear it and join in. More and more voices layer on top of one another until nearly everyone left standing in Ooh is singing the same simple, hopeful tune into the face of something ancient enough to have preceded the concept of tune. It's a genuinely strange thing for a finale to hinge on, and it works precisely because the show had spent 10 years establishing that connection, love, and the specific harmony of people choosing to stand together were always the deepest magic available to anyone in this world. Order, in the most literal musical sense, turns out to be the natural predator of chaos. Inside Golb's body, where Finn, Simon, and Betty have all been swallowed, something the show describes, almost casually, as a kind of digestive unmaking begins working on them, stripping away accumulated years and curses and corrupted history, reverting things towards simpler, earlier states. It's here that Simon is finally, after 1,000 years, separated from the crown. The crown's power, absorbed or dissolved by Golb's own chaotic nature, releases him completely. He becomes, for the first time since a dock worker in northern Scandinavia sold him a magical object he never should have put on his head, simply Simon Petrikov again, old, powerless, human, standing in the stomach of a chaos god, next to the fiancé who traveled 1,000 years through time to reach this exact moment. Betty gets them out. She stays behind. She tries to wish Golb out of existence entirely using the crown, now restored to its original, unfiltered wish granting function. And it doesn't work because Golb's power is simply too large for even a cosmic artifact to erase. So she changes the wish. She asks instead that Simon be protected, no matter the cost, and the crown, taking her at her word the way wish-granting magic always does in this show's honest and occasionally cruel internal logic, fuses her directly with Golb himself. Two entities become one. The being that results, called Golbetty in the material that follows, carries Betty's consciousness now, somewhere inside all that chaos, banished from this dimension, gone through a portal that closes behind her, leaving Simon standing on solid ground, sane, alive, and alone in a way he hasn't been alone in over a millennium, because for the first time in 1,000 years, the person missing from his life isn't a version of himself. It's her. There's an idea worth sitting with here, offered as interpretation rather than confirmed fact, because the show never states it in these terms directly. Golb's design, according to material from the people who built him, drew deliberately from a specific corner of cosmic horror fiction, the kind of ancient, indifferent gods who don't hate humanity so much as simply fail to notice it, whose scale renders human suffering incomprehensible rather than cruel. What makes Golb genuinely unsettling in a way the Lich, for all his menace, never quite manages, is that Golb doesn't want anything. He has no plan, no ideology, no grievance against the people fighting him. He is simply what happens when disorder is given a body large enough to be seen. The Lich wanted an ending. Golb doesn't want anything at all, which somehow makes him worse, because there's no reasoning with an entity that isn't for or against anything. That would flatten your entire kingdom with exactly the same indifference it would use to flatten an empty field. And it's against that specific, terrifying kind of nothing that the show chose to place its single most human weapon, a small robot singing about how nothing you love is ever really gone, just moved into the past, still there if you know how to look, that the song works, that harmony genuinely wins against a god of chaos, is either the most naive thing the show ever did or the bravest thing it ever said. I lean toward the second reading, but that's a judgment call, not a fact, and you're welcome to land somewhere else. There's a quieter detail worth pulling out of this whole sequence before we move on, because it's easy to lose it inside the sheer spectacle of a battlefield-sized chaos god. The Lich, in the material that follows this confrontation, eventually crosses paths with Golbetty directly and, in a moment of genuine desperation, appeals to the very being he spent his entire existence worshipping, asking why his devotion, his millennia of faithful service toward the extinction of all life, was never once acknowledged or rewarded. Golbetty's response is to seal him inside a floating, many-sided shape, his screaming head trapped within it, an ending that reads less like a defeat handed down by an enemy and more like the specific, cold indifference of a god who was simply never listening to begin with. That's the cruelest possible outcome for a character who organized his entire cosmic purpose around being someone's faithful scholar. He wasn't punished for his devotion. He was simply never noticed enough to be punished on purpose. Chaos, it turns out, doesn't reward its followers any more than it holds a grudge against its enemies. It doesn't do either of those things, because doing either would require caring, and caring was never part of what Golb was built to represent. Now come up out of the cosmic and back down into something smaller and, in its own way, sadder. Because there's a family in the Candy Kingdom that almost nobody remembers is a family at all. Because for most of the show's run, they existed as background characters with no apparent interior life whatsoever. That's the whole point, as it turns out. And once you understand why, you can't unsee it in every crowd scene set in Princess Bubblegum's castle ever again. Roughly 800 years before the main events of the series, according to the show's own internal chronology, a very young Bonnibel Bubblegum was living alone in the post-apocalyptic wasteland that would eventually become her kingdom, keeping company with only her infant brother Nettie, having recently separated from the strange, tree-like organism the show calls the Mother Gum, from which both of them had originally grown. She was lonely, genuinely, achingly lonely, in the specific way children are lonely, when the adults who should be present simply aren't. And she did the only thing available to someone with her particular scientific abilities. She built herself a family. An uncle, named Gumbald, an aunt, named Lolly, a cousin, named Shakel. She designed them deliberately to fit specific roles, an uncle archetype, an aunt archetype, the whole apparatus of a household she'd never actually had, engineered from scratch, because nobody was going to hand it to her. For a while, it worked. They built a small candy town together. They planted taffy trees. There's something genuinely moving in the show's own visual language during this stretch. A brief window of found family warmth before everything curdles, made all the more poignant by the knowledge available to anyone watching with the benefit of hindsight of exactly how completely it's about to fall apart. Gumbald had ideas of his own. He cut down the very taffy trees the family had planted together without asking to clear space for a cabin, and told his niece plainly that he intended to build an entire candy city on his own terms, under his own name. Bonnie didn't like it. She used one of her early experiments to flood the site he wanted with an entire lake of butterscotch, killing his development plans before they could start. And Gumbald, in the show's memorable framing of his own perspective, was furious, not because he was wrong to want something for himself, but because his niece, who had created him specifically to be family rather than staff, kept behaving as though creation implied ownership, as though the people she'd made owed her total obedience, simply because she was the one who'd made them. It's worth sitting with the ethical tangle here, because the show clearly wants you to notice it rather than resolve it too quickly. Gumbald wasn't purely a villain in this stretch of the story. He and his fellow creations had a legitimate grievance. Bonnibel had built them to be equals in form and then treated them reflexively as subordinates in practice, because that was easier, because that was safer, because 800 years ago, she was still a frightened child who genuinely believed that control and love were the same instinct, wearing different clothes. Gumbald's response to that grievance was, however, monstrous, and the show doesn't let him off the hook for it either. He created a serum, a so-called happy juice, engineered to strip a person of complex thought and turn them into a cheerful, biddable, permanently simple-minded candy person. He tested it, first, on the family members closest to him, tricking Lolly and Scheichel into eating cupcakes laced with the stuff, transforming his own wife and son, functionally, into obedient strangers who no longer remembered they had ever been anyone else, all in the service of consolidating a power base loyal enough to move against Bonnibel herself. He tried it on her too, distracting her first with an artificial boyfriend built specifically to occupy her attention for an afternoon, a manufactured romance whose sole function was to clear the field for a coup. It didn't work on Bonnie. In the ensuing confrontation, the serum splashed back onto Gumbald's own face instead, transforming him permanently into a large, simple minded, cheerfully oblivious punch bowl, forgetting entirely who he had once been or what he had once wanted. Here is the detail the show waits nearly the entire series to reveal, and it recontextualizes an enormous amount of incidental background material once you have it. That punch bowl, a minor, wordless prop character who has been hanging around the edges of Candy Kingdom scenes since the earliest seasons, known casually to viewers as Punchy, was Gumbald the entire time. So was Manfred, the talking piñata who occasionally announces visitors at the castle. So was Crunchy, another minor background figure barely worth naming in earlier episodes. Lolly and Chickle, stripped of their old selves by the very serum they had helped concoct, had been living in the Candy Kingdom for 800 years as harmless, forgotten props, occupying the same halls as the niece they had once conspired against, with neither side remembering there had ever been a conspiracy at all. Bonnibel, for her part, made a decision in the aftermath that the show treats with real moral weight rather than easy comfort. She looked at what her family had become: simple, cheerful, entirely without the capacity for the kind of betrayal that had just cost her everything, and decided, consciously, that this was safer, happier, even by her own accounting. She began, from that point forward, deliberately designing every subsequent Candy person to be simple-minded by default, sacrificing complexity for obedience across her entire kingdom, a policy choice with staggering ethical implications that the show let sit there, mostly unexamined by the characters themselves, for the audience to notice on its own. Princess Bubblegum did not simply inherit a kingdom of cheerful, docile subjects. She built it that way, on purpose, after the one time she allowed the people close to her to be genuinely complex, and it nearly destroyed her. The story doesn't end there, because nothing in this show's mythology of buried grievances ever really does. Late in the run, a magical event known as the Anti-Elemental Release, triggered by Lumpy Space Princess during a crisis involving the show's 4 classical elements, reverts every transformed being in Ooh back to its original, true shape. Gumbald, Lolly, and Chickle all snap back, instantly, after 800 years, into exactly who they used to be. Memories, grievances, and unfinished plans fully intact, as though no time had passed at all. They immediately, without hesitation, resume the coup they'd been in the middle of executing 8 centuries earlier. Gumbald builds an entire rival city-state, Gumbaldia, in what the show describes as an implausibly short amount of time, staffs it with an army of cake soldiers, and declares outright war on the niece who created him. What follows, across the show's final stretch, is a conflict the writers frame less as a fresh villain plot and more as the long-delayed conclusion of an argument that had simply been paused, not settled, for 800 years, waiting patiently inside the bodies of a punch bowl and a piñata for the right magical circumstance to wake it back up. The resolution, when it finally comes during the extended finale, is neither clean nor entirely satisfying, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than tying it into a neater bow than the show itself provides. Finn and Jake engineer a shared nightmare meant to force Bubblegum and Gumbald into some kind of reconciliation, and inside it, genuine apology passes between them, genuine acknowledgement of the old wound on both sides. But Gumbald's contrition turns out to be partly performance, an attempt to lower his niece's guard long enough to strike again, and it's Lolly, not Bubblegum, who ultimately stops him, tripping him at the crucial moment, and dousing him once more in his own serum, reverting him permanently back into the punch bowl, this time, apparently for good. Lolly steps into leadership of Gumbaldia in his place, and an uneasy peace settles between the two candy nations just before Gulb's arrival forces every remaining grievance in Uo to take a back seat to collective survival. It's genuinely worth asking, and critics of the episode have asked it, whether justice was actually served here, or whether the show simply found a convenient way to put a dangerous, complicated, understandably aggrieved character back into a body with no interior life at all, silencing the argument rather than resolving it. I don't think the show fully answers that question, and I'm not sure it was trying to. Some family wounds, even in a kingdom built entirely of candy, just don't close all the way. They get managed, they get contained, and the people managing them don't always get to feel good about how they did it. What stays with me most about this whole buried history isn't the war or the betrayal or even the serum, though all three of those are genuinely dark ideas for a show ostensibly aimed at children. It's the image of a small, frightened girl, alone except for an infant brother, standing in the wreckage of a destroyed world, deciding that the solution to her loneliness was to build the people who would love her rather than wait for people who already existed to find her. There's something both deeply resourceful and deeply sad in that impulse, and the show never asks you to pick only one of those readings. She succeeded for a while. She built a family, a home, an entire functioning civilization out of nothing but candy and desperation and scientific talent far beyond her years. And then the family she built, the first real proof that her loneliness could be solved, turned out to want something other than what she'd designed them to want. And she had to choose. At an age when nobody should have to make choices like this, between the fragile idea of family she'd invented for herself and her own survival, she chose survival. 800 years later, she's still governing an entire kingdom shaped by the exact terms of that choice. Still, surrounded by candy, people who cannot betray her precisely because she made sure of it after the one-time betrayal actually happened. That's not a villain's origin story. It's a survivor's, and the show is honest enough to let both of those things be true about the same woman at once. There's one more figure worth pulling out of the background before we go all the way to the bottom, because she gets treated by a huge portion of this show's audience as pure comic relief, and comic relief is only ever half of what she actually is. Lumpy Space Princess floats through the land of Oo as a purple cloud with a sharp temper, a flair for melodrama, and a vocabulary built almost entirely around the word lump, used in place of language. A children's cartoon isn't allowed to use directly. It would be easy, and plenty of viewers do exactly this, to write her off as a one-note gag, the show's resident drama queen, good for a laugh and not much else. But underneath the theatrics is a genuinely lonely figure whose comedy functions, the way comedy often does in real people, as armor over something much rawer. In the episode, The Monster, the show finally lets us see what happened to her during one of the stretches when she'd run away from her parents' home and disappeared from Oo's social circles entirely. She'd been living, for a while, with a pack of wolves who took her in and treated her, as far as the show's telling goes, as one of their own. It's a strange, quietly touching image, this floating, sarcastic, teenage cloud person curled up among actual wild animals because they were the only ones willing to have her unconditionally. It didn't last. She caused enough drama within the pack apparently accusing one wolf of infidelity in a dispute. The wolves themselves had no framework for even understanding that they eventually banished her too, and she ended up terrorizing a nearby village instead, using their fear of her strange, cloud-like appearance to steal crops and survive on her own. When Finn and Jake finally track her down, expecting a monster, they find someone lashing out because lashing out has, by that point in her life, become the only strategy she has left for getting anyone to pay attention to her at all. She reconciles with her parents by the episode's end, but the show doesn't pretend the reconciliation erases what led her into those woods in the first place. An argument at home severe enough that being adopted by wolves felt, to her, like the better option. It's here that a piece of speculation becomes worth raising carefully, because it isn't fully confirmed within the show itself, but is strongly implied by the show's own broader cosmology of elemental beings. Late in the run, during the arc dealing with the four classical elements that secretly underlie the magic of Oo, Lumpy Space Princess is revealed to be something far larger than a floating teenager with body image issues and an ex-boyfriend named Brad. She is the physical incarnation of the Lump's anti-elemental, a being whose entire cosmic function is to resist and ultimately dissolve the influence of the other four elements when their power grows dangerous enough to threaten the world. It is her lumps, quite literally, her ability to remain unaffected by forces that transform everyone else she encounters, that make her the only person capable of moving safely through every elemental kingdom during the crisis and eventually breaking the spell, holding all of Oo hostage. The show frames this almost as a punchline at first, because Lumpy Space Princess herself doesn't understand her own significance any better than the people around her do. She just knows. She feels bored and unaffected everywhere everyone else is being dramatically transformed, and it takes Finn, of all people, pointing out that her total resistance to elemental influence might actually matter for anyone to realize what she actually is. There is something genuinely moving, if you're willing to sit with it, in the idea that a character built almost entirely out of insecurity, melodrama, and a desperate hunger to be taken seriously turns out to be, cosmically speaking, one of the most quietly essential beings in the entire land of Oo, and that nobody, including her, had any idea until the moment it mattered most. In the show's final scene, crowning its major surviving characters into the shapes their long arcs had been building toward, Lumpy Space Princess is shown ruling as queen, her own parents bowing to her, an image the show earns entirely through years of treating a joke character with more patience than jokes usually get. There's a lesson buried in that particular reveal that applies well beyond the borders of Oo, and it's worth stating plainly rather than leaving it as subtext. The characters we write off as too much, too dramatic, too consumed with their own insecurities to be taken seriously are very often carrying something the people around them simply haven't bothered to look for yet. Lumpy Space Princess spends most of this show being laughed at gently by an audience that has been trained by nearly every other piece of media it has ever consumed to treat exactly her type of character as disposable comic filler. And the show, in its final stretch, quietly overturns that entire assumption, not by changing who she is, but by revealing that who she'd been all along was never actually small. She was always the thing capable of dissolving forces that could unmake kingdoms. She just also happened to be a teenager with a complicated relationship to an ex-boyfriend named Brad, because those two facts, it turns out, were never actually in tension with each other. People contain both of those registers simultaneously all the time. It's only in fiction, usually, that we insist on separating them out into different characters, the comic relief over here, the cosmic significance over there. Adventure Time kept refusing to make that separation in Lumpy Space Princess and in nearly everyone else it ever gave enough time to. There's one more secret buried in a body everyone thought they already understood completely, and it belongs to Jake, which surprised a huge number of longtime viewers when it finally surfaced. Because of all the major characters in this show, Jake had always seemed like the one whose origins were simple, settled, already fully explained by the time you'd watched more than a handful of episodes. Finn's past came loaded with unanswered questions from the very beginning. The missing parents, the mysterious circumstances of being found alone in the woods as an infant. Marceline's past was explicitly mysterious for years before the show was ready to touch it. But Jake, easygoing, warm, endlessly relaxed Jake, seemed like the one character you didn't need to worry about. He had two loving parents. He had a brother. He had, by all appearances, the most uncomplicated family story in the entire cast. The show let you believe that for 6 full seasons before it started, quietly and without warning, pulling the thread that would eventually unravel the whole thing. He's a magical dog. His parents are Joshua and Margaret, two adventuring dog people whose warmth and eccentricity clearly shaped both their sons, Jake and his older brother Jermaine. That was the working assumption for 6 full seasons. And then, in the episode Joshua and Margaret Investigations, the show quietly cracked that assumption open and never fully closed it back up. Tree Trunks reports a strange creature in the forest, and Joshua and Margaret, still working as adventurers themselves at that point in their lives, go to investigate. What they find is a shape-shifting, extra-dimensional being, later given the name Warren Ampersand, currently wearing the form of a cat. It bites Joshua on the head, not playfully. The bite leaves him seriously ill, poisoned by something in the creature's venom that Margaret has to travel out and retrieve an antidote for directly from the source. And from the boil that bite leaves on Joshua's head, over time, Jake is born. Let that sit for a second, because the show does not spell out, in the moment, how strange and how uncomfortable that detail actually is. Jake's biological parent, in the most literal genetic sense, is not Margaret at all. It's Joshua, and the creature that made it happen never asked his permission, delivering its genetic material through what amounts to an act of violation dressed up in the show's earliest telling as a goofy, monster of the week complication. Margaret raised Jake as her own regardless, love asking no questions about biology, but neither she nor Joshua ever told their son the truth of where he'd actually come from. Jake grew up entirely unaware that the family story he'd been told his whole life had a version underneath it that nobody was willing to say out loud. The show let that thread sit, mostly dormant, for years, occasionally surfacing it in dream sequences, in orb and abstract, episodes where Jake's shape begins to distort in ways nobody can explain, drawing him closer, physically, to a form nobody around him recognizes. It isn't until the 10th and final season, in the 2-part story, The First Investigation, and Jake, the Star Child, that the show finally answers the question directly. Jake witnesses his own birth through what the show calls a time slip, an experience that forces him to confront, all at once, exactly how he came into the world, and exactly what Joshua and Margaret chose never to tell him. And then Warren Ampersand himself finally appears in the present, an alien creature, tall, blue-skinned, 5-eyed, claiming to be dying and pulling Jake through a portal to a distant homeworld to, in his own framing, pass on a final piece of family legacy before it's too late. What follows is one of the more quietly disturbing character reveals this show ever allowed itself, precisely because it plays, for most of its runtime, like a heartfelt reunion between an estranged father and the son he never got to raise. Warren builds Jake a museum, documenting his entire life, wall after wall of photographs, a wordless confession that he's been secretly watching his son from a distance for years, the way an absent, guilty parent sometimes does when direct involvement feels like more than they can offer. He calls himself Proud Pop. He gives Jake a belt labeled Galaxy Savior and tells him he's fated to defeat a terrible cosmic threat the very next day. It plays, for a while, like the show finally granting Jake the kind of paternal validation it had already worked through, more painfully, in Finn's own relationship with his absent father Martin. And then the floor drops out. The entire threat was fabricated. The whole ordeal, the belts, the prophecy, the supposed monster, was elaborate machinery designed for exactly one purpose: to drain Jake of his youth and his stretching power, and extend Warren's own unnaturally long life at his son's expense. The same thing, it turns out, Warren has quietly done to an unknown number of other offspring across other worlds and other timelines, discarding each of them once they'd been used up. He admits, almost as an aside, that Jake is the only one of his children he's ever felt any real guilt about draining. It doesn't stop him from trying anyway. Jake outsmarts him. In the end, the way Jake tends to outsmart people who underestimate how much easy warmth can coexist with real cunning. He tricks Warren into an embrace, specifically engineered to swap the two belts, reclaiming his stolen youth in the process. And when Warren, defeated and furious, discovers that Jake has children of his own and immediately pivots toward wanting to drain them too, Jake throws his own biological father directly into a black hole to protect them. Warren's final words as he vanishes, delivered with the specific tone of someone who refuses to accept that anything has actually ended for him, or that he's going four-dimensional, a line the show leaves, deliberately ambiguous, about whether it means death or merely another kind of departure, consistent with how casually this show tends to treat its most cosmic exits. There's something worth sitting with in how differently the show treats Jake's two absent father narratives, because it never draws the comparison directly, but it's sitting right there, for anyone tracking both threads. Finn's father, Martin, is selfish, unreliable, and ultimately incapable of real love. But the show is careful never to make him a monster. He's written deliberately as a small, disappointing man, rather than an evil one, someone whose failures as a parent come from self-absorption rather than malice. Warren Ampersand is something closer to an actual predator, a being who manufactures children specifically to consume them later, whose affection, when it appears at all, is calculated rather than felt. Finn spends the show wanting a relationship with his father and having to grieve the fact that wanting it doesn't make his father capable of giving it. Jake doesn't get that particular grief because Warren was never withholding love Jake might have earned. There was nothing there to withhold in the first place. What Jake gets instead is the quieter, stranger revelation that the family he always assumed was simply his, uncomplicated, warm, given rather than chosen, was actually the product of a decision Joshua and Margaret made together, deliberately, to raise a child that wasn't biologically theirs, and to love him so completely that the distinction never needed to matter until an alien with 5 eyes forced it into the open. Jake's whole personality, the ease, the warmth, the total lack of anxiety about who deserves what, reads differently once you know that the family that shaped him wasn't obligated by biology to take him in at all. They simply decided to. That speculation about theme, rather than a stated fact of the show, but it lines up awfully well with everything else this series ever said about the difference between the family you're given and the family that actually shows up. We're close to the bottom now, and the last layer isn't set in ooh at all. It's set in the writer's room in Los Angeles, in the actual human circumstances that produced everything I've just described to you, because the story of how this show got made is, in its own way, as strange and as honest as anything that happens inside it. Pendleton Ward built Adventure Time out of a 7-minute short, and by the time the full series had run for several years, it had become one of the biggest cult phenomena on American television, watched by roughly 14 million people a week. At its peak, spinning off a merchandising empire, video games, comics that sold in the hundreds of thousands, all of it stacked on top of a show whose creator, by his own account, was a deeply introverted person who had spent much of his childhood feeling, in his words, like an outcast among outcasts. Someone who had once been so unsure of how to read the people around him that he literally took written notes on their behavior to try to make sense of it. Running a hit show meant, for Ward, dealing with people constantly, endlessly, at a scale that had nothing to do with the actual creative work he loved and everything to do with the pressures of managing something that had grown far larger than he ever intended it to become. He said, plainly, years later, that dealing with people every day wears on you, that spending the energy required to keep something worth making at that scale, worth making, simply wore him out. So, quietly, without any public announcement, at some point during the show's 5th season, Pendleton Ward stepped down as showrunner. He didn't leave the project entirely. He stayed on as a writer and storyboard artist for a while longer, remaining connected to the creative texture of the show even as he handed the actual operational weight of running it to Adam Mudo, a classmate of his from CalArts, who had been with the project from its earliest days as a storyboard artist and had, in effect, been training toward this handoff without either of them necessarily planning it that way. Ward has said, describing the decision, that he quit because it was driving him nuts, offered not with regret, but with something closer to relief, a statement that for him, having quality of life mattered more than the need to keep total creative control over something he'd made. It's worth sitting with how quietly this happened, given the scale of what was being handed off. A show watched by 14 million people a week changed leadership in its middle stretch, with almost no public fanfare at the time, and the audience largely didn't notice a seismic shift because Muto, trained specifically to carry the tone Ward had established, kept the show recognizably itself even as it deepened, under his direction, into the more serialized, lore-heavy, emotionally patient version of itself that produced most of the material examined tonight. Muto has since said that Cartoon Network itself was initially resistant to that shift, away from standalone episodes toward the longer, more connected storytelling the show eventually became known for, worried, reasonably from a business perspective, about how you promote and market a show that increasingly required viewers to have seen what came before. The tension between what makes a show easy to sell and what makes a show worth going back to for years afterward runs quietly underneath this entire piece of production history and Adventure Time. In the end, chose depth over easy marketability, A choice that clearly paid off in the loyalty of exactly the kind of viewer watching something like this at whatever hour it currently is where you are. There's one more piece of behind the scenes history worth including here because it explains, in plain factual terms, where one of the show's most significant relationships actually came from. Rebecca Sugar, who would go on to create Steven Universe after her time on this show, was working as a storyboard artist on Adventure Time when she read through material involving Marceline and Princess Bubblegum and suggested to Adam Muto directly that the tension and cryptic history between the two characters would make more sense, would carry more weight if they had once been in a romantic relationship that had ended badly. The show's creative team liked the idea and folded it in, deliberately, subtextually, careful not to state it outright in a way that could invite network pushback, but clear enough that audiences paying attention understood exactly what was being implied in Marceline's music and in the specific, wounded way she and Bubblegum interacted for years afterward. That subtext sparked real discussion and, at points, real controversy among viewers, some delighted, some uncertain what to make of a children's cartoon carrying that kind of relationship in its foundation. It would take years and the show's own patient accumulation of trust with its audience before the finale and the later specials allowed that relationship to be stated plainly rather than implied. A kiss confirmed on screen, a home shared afterward, a decision made by the creative team to finally say clearly what they had been building quietly since one storyboard artist's suggestion years earlier changed the entire emotional architecture of two of the show's most important characters. It's worth remembering, too, just how many people passed through this show's writer's room over the years it was on the air, because the list reads less like a staff roster and more like a partial map of the animation that would define the following decade. Rebecca Sugar left to build Steven Universe, a series that would carry forward the same instinct for burying enormous emotional stakes underneath bright colors and simple character designs. Patrick McHale left to make Over the Garden Wall, a miniseries that took Adventure Time's comfort with melancholy and pushed it even further into folk horror and grief. Ian Jones Quartey went on to create OKKO, Let's Be Heroes. Julia Pott made Summer Camp Island. All of them came up together in the same cramped rooms, working on the same show, absorbing the same specific lesson that a story aimed at children doesn't have to lie to them about what the world actually contains. It's a strange kind of legacy for a show to leave behind, not just the episodes themselves, but an entire generation of people who learned, by making this one specific thing together, exactly how far you could push warmth and honesty into the same sentence without either one canceling the other out. Pendleton Ward gave that lesson to a room full of people before he ever fully learned how to protect his own peace while living inside it. And there's something worth sitting with in that too, the idea that the thing you build can teach everyone around you something you yourself are still struggling to learn how to use. Before we surface all the way, it's worth pausing on something that connects every single layer we've gone through tonight. Something that doesn't show up in any single episode, but sits underneath all of them, like groundwater. Every character examined in this particular descent, the Cosmic Owl, Fern, Susan Strong, Golb in its strange, indifferent scale, the Bubblegum family that turned on itself, Jake through the revelation of Warren Ampersand, Lumpy Space Princess, even Pendleton Ward himself in the very real, very human story of his own burnout is, in one way or another, a story about the gap between what a person or a being is assumed to be and what they actually turn out to be. Underneath that assumption, Nobody expected the owl to be carrying guilt. Nobody expected the sword to have a person trapped inside it. Nobody expected the fish-headed cave dweller to have once been a soldier, or the chaos god to be capable of losing someone he never truly possessed, or the punch bowl to have been an uncle, or the floating cloud to be cosmically load-bearing, or the goofy dog to be the product of an act neither of his adoptive parents ever found the courage to name aloud, or the guy who made all of this to eventually admit in a magazine profile that the very thing fans loved him for was the thing slowly costing him his peace. Adventure Time built its entire mythology on the specific, patient practice of assuming there was always more underneath whatever you thought you already understood. That's not a coincidence spread across a handful of episodes. That's the actual shape of the show's imagination, repeated so many times in so many different registers that it stops looking like a storytelling technique and starts looking like a worldview. So here's what's actually sitting at the bottom of this iceberg. Once you've gone all the way down through the owl and the sword and the fish people and the chaos god and the candy family and the sad queen of a lumpy kingdom and the exhausted, overwhelmed man who built the whole thing before handing it carefully to a friend who could carry it further. It's not really about ooh at all. It's about how meaning gets built the same way ooh itself got built, in layers, mostly by accident, mostly by people working under real pressure, making decisions that felt small at the time. A wizard tells a joke about grass and accidentally creates a person who has to spend his brief life wondering if he's allowed to exist. A lonely girl builds herself a family out of candy because nobody handed her one. And 800 years later, that decision is still shaping the moral architecture of an entire kingdom. A cartoonist gets so worn down by the size of what he made that he has to hand it to someone else to keep it alive, and the show only gets deeper, richer, and more patient because of that handoff, not despite it. None of this was planned from the start. Almost none of the show's deepest ideas were planned from the start. They accumulated, the way grief accumulates, the way love accumulates, the way an entire mythology can grow out of a throwaway joke about businessmen in an iceberg if you just keep pulling the thread long enough and refuse to let any single detail be meaningless. I think that's actually the whole argument this show ever made about anything, that nothing is only what it looks like on the surface, that the owl in your dream might carry 1,000 years of guilt behind its eyes, that the sword you bought for $3 might have a person trapped inside it, waiting to find out if he's allowed to be real, that the punch bowl sitting quietly in the corner of the throne room might remember, somewhere underneath the cheerful simplicity someone else designed for him, exactly who he used to be, and that the cloud-shaped girl everyone dismisses as a joke might be the only thing standing between the whole world and total dissolution, whether she knows it yet or not. You can sleep on that if you want. The land of ooh isn't going anywhere, and neither is whatever waits underneath your own surface, patient, quiet, growing slowly toward the moment it finally gets to matter. Somewhere tonight, in whatever room you're lying in, there's probably a version of your own iceberg sitting just under the part of you that other people get to see, a decision that felt small at the time, but is still quietly shaping everything built on top of it, a piece of yourself you inherited without asking for it, a role you've been playing for so long you've half forgotten it was ever a role at all, rather than simply who you are. You don't have to go digging for it tonight. That's not what this is for. It's enough, sometimes, just to remember that the digging is possible, that the surface was never the whole story, for a cartoon about a boy and his dog, and probably not for you either. If tonight found you somewhere in this, if the owl or the grass boy or the punch bowl or the lonely cloud girl or the dog who never knew the whole truth about his own birth landed the way I hoped they might. It helps more than you'd think to leave a like on your way out and to subscribe if you haven't already, so the next layer down finds you when it's ready. There's always another one waiting, a little further down than the last, and I'll be here whenever you're ready to keep going. Rest well. There's always more underneath.